Welcome to the 9th in our series of Urban Transport Next conversations with a live online audience on the topics that will help determine the future of urban transport. So whether you're spending your lunchtime with us listening live, or whether you're listening to the podcast later or watching the playback on YouTube, thanks so much for joining us. I'm Jonathan Bray, Director of the Urban Transport Group, the organisation that's hosting these events. And for those of you who don't know us, we bring together the public sector transport authorities for the largest urban areas. Transport for London, Transport for Greater Manchester, Transport for West Midlands, and all the other major metro areas as well, serving over 20 million people. As well as being a body that thinks ahead about what's next for urban transport, our members can implement that thinking on the ground and can and do learn collectively from these events. And at UTG, we like to look ahead at what's next on urban transport policy. So we're delighted to give this space to talk about the role that e-bikes can play and how we can fully realise their potential off the back of the report that we published earlier this week. And we could not have a better panel to discuss this. So we have Olga Anapryenka, who's the author of the report and that we published earlier this week, principal consultant for STEER and co-founder of the Women in Mobility UK network. We have Roger Geffen, the Policy Director of Cycling UK. Roger Geffen's involvement in cycling campaigning began as a volunteer with the London cycling campaign in the late 1980s, and he soon branched out into other transport and environmental groups, including anti-road campaigns in the mid-1990s, which is where Roger and I got to know each other very well indeed. And he joined Cycling UK as campaigns and policy manager, now policy director in 2002, received an MBE for services to cycling in 2015. And we'll learn more about our panelists during the conversation. And interviewing our panelist is Phillip Darnton, OB, the chair of the Bicycle Association, which represents the UK cycle industry. He also chairs the Cycle Rail Working Group for the Department for Transport and sits on the DfT's Active Travel Stakeholder Advisory Group. Phillip was awarded an OBE in 2011 for services to cycling. So you can also be part of this conversation in three ways. Firstly, by putting questions, keep them short and sharp via the Zoom questions box. And you can also vote for your favourite question. We'll be picking these up in the final section of the conversation. You can also use the comments channel of the Zoom call, and of course on Twitter using the hashtag UTGNext, hashtag UTGNext. And with that, I will hand over to Phillip.
Jonathan, thank you very much, and welcome to everybody to this session on the potential for e-bikes. I think we might start off at the beginning, Olga, with asking you a bit about your background and how you came to be involved in cycling in general, e-bikes in particular, and indeed whether you've practiced what you preach and ride one regularly.
Sure. Thank you, Phillip, and thank you for the introduction. Well, I've been working in transportation for the last, I think, 6 years, and I work in the new mobility area. So basically any innovation in transport probably I will deal with. And well, as part of the move to more sustainable ways of travel, active travel is under the I would say it's under attention, and it's something that, well, I'm quite passionate about, because I think if you look at the transport mix and hierarchy of different modes, I truly believe that active travel should be there, and here we'll find cycling. I'm a cyclist myself, but I do not have bike. It got stolen recently from my basement in London where I live. But so at the moment, I use shared bikes, and I do use shared e-bikes, which I find quite useful. So from my perspective, cycling to work, it's easy. It only takes me 15 minutes. I don't sweat, and well, can look fine when I'm at my desk. So yeah, that's me.
Very good, excellent. Well, I'm sure we'll come back to the question of shared e-bikes, a very, very interesting topic we're bound to get to before too long. Roger, I don't think I'd realised that just how much longer than you have been involved in the world of cycling until that introduction. Go on, tell us what drives you. And I know that you're a keen, proper cyclist. What do you think about e-bikes? Have you got an e-bike? Have you ridden an e-bike? But what is it that drives you in this over such a long period of time?
Well, thank you, Philip. Yes, just to start with the little bit of potted history. So I cycled as a child, I cycled as a teenager, I cycled as a university student. Then when I moved back to London, started doing my first job in central London, still living with my parents at that time. And I just decided to take up cycling because it was going to be cheaper, and frankly, the mild eccentricity of it kind of appealed to me. I rapidly discovered that what I was doing wasn't crazy. I was overtaking a lot of people in metal boxes on London's congested streets, and that was much more crazy than what I was doing. Then I discovered there was this thing called the London Cycling Campaign. I was in London, I was cycling, I could see why you might want to campaign for it. That really was the start of my journey into where I am now. As Jonathan mentioned in his introduction, I then got involved in stopping road schemes in the mid-1990s, got to know Jonathan very well, and indeed a lot of other people who are still involved in cycle advocacy. A lot of us have been in this game a long time. Yes, cycling is such it's a fantastic, very simple answer to an awful lot of very complicated problems. Whether it's safer streets, less congested streets, places which enable just a wider range of people to get around, from children. Anyone can get around pretty much by cycling, and yet it is so marginalised in ways that just don't make sense. And of course, the really relevant point is that it's potentially a really important, significant part of the solution to climate change. So there are so many good reasons to take up cycling. And of course, e-bikes particularly help strengthen the case for cycling as a solution to climate change, because they add to the distance that people can travel, as well as the range of people who could take up cycling.
I think, Roger, that you anticipated my remark about the range of people who can take it up. And I'm sure we'll come back to that point too, about who are e-bikes for. And it's a particular bugbear of mine that there have been a whole series of quite senior politicians who seem to think they're for people who've got a bad hair day, or live on the top of a hill, or are very old, or a bit fat. I'm sure we will want to talk about who they're for. Also, I think it's very timely. Indeed, I don't know whether Jonathan planned it, absolutely, that we should be talking about the potential for e-bikes right at the time of COP26. It came as something of a surprise to me when I found out some years ago that the Office for Low Emission Vehicles, now called the Office for Zero Emission Vehicles, actually doesn't have anything to do with e-bikes at all. And yet there they are, sat there as the absolute answer to zero emission. And across Europe, that's, I think, something that's rather different. I picked out the statistics that e-bike sales now across Europe are higher than for any other form of electric vehicle, including all hybrid and all electric cars combined. So I think that today's conversation is very much about what's going on here and what are we going to do about it? And it's not just a question of having a conversation. I'm hoping that out of this, people who are listening will go away thinking, yes, actually, there are things that we can do that we haven't done yet. And I'm sure there are many people who are listening who have already started and hopefully will be encouraged and enthused by what we have to say. I think that I should probably outline how we might manage this time, because I know with this panel, it will be rather difficult to keep to time. But here we go. I think it's in three bits. So first of all, where are we now? What is going on? Then I think a section about what's the opportunity for e-bikes. And then probably a rather longer part, which is how are we going to realize that opportunity? How are we going to get there? What are the ideas that we can really put forward today? And at the end, no doubt some questions too from people who may be practicing this already. So if we start off with where are we now? One of the things that's in your report, Olga, I think is very telling, which is that an enormous number of people don't actually know what an e-bike is. And I think we had better just clear that up immediately. An electrically assisted pedal cycle. Roger, do you want to start on what is an electrically assisted pedal cycle?
Straight away into the legal definition. So it is
not heavyweight.
Yes. Okay. So I think the crucial point is that to be legally classed as a pedal cycle and not a motorcycle, an e-bike has to have a maximum power of 250 watts and a maximum speed at which for the motor to work of 25 kilometers per hour or 15 miles per hour. They can only be ridden by people aged 14 and over. That, so long as they meet those conditions, they can be ridden effectively as pedal cycles without the rider having to pass a test or be insured or licensed, and without having to wear helmets and all of those conditions that attach to motorcycles. Effectively, this creates a distinction between an electric bicycle and electric motorcycle. And that is important. And the reason for the 250 watt limit, it does actually make sense because it's roughly the power output that an average fit human can sustain over a decent period of time. So without being a peak athlete and without just talking about sort of little tiny spurts, this is about the amount that a human can sustain over a decent period of time. So 250 watts is roughly the point at which you move. If you go above 250 watts, you're moving into a motor powered cycle rather than a human powered cycle with electric assistance. And that is important, and it is important to maintain this distinction if electrically assisted pedal cycles are to share space and use cycle tracks and have all the privileges that go with being basically pedal cycles.
And of course, one of the things that's happening at the moment is that all kinds of things that look quite like bicycles and absolutely aren't bicycles are appearing on the road. So keeping this distinction of an electrically assisted pedal cycle, 15.5 miles an hour, 250 watts, is extremely, extremely important. Olga, do you think that people actually do understand about what an e-bike is? And if they do, what's holding them up from getting one or riding one?
Yeah, I think that actually a majority of people do not know much about e-bikes, and there's something that should be done in more like marketing, promotion, education, actually allowing people to try the bikes. So I think, well, if we look at the state what's happening now, I think the UK is lagging behind other European countries. I think in 2019, the new sales of e-bikes accounted for like 3% of bikes sold, and if you compare it to other European countries, it would be like something around 10 to 30%. And I think recently in 2020, accelerated by the pandemic, Germany was doing a specifically good, because I think the stats shows that in 2020, around 2 million people bought new electric bikes in Germany. And then you're kind of asking what's happening in the UK and why people are not doing the same as other European nations. And I think, as you mentioned, first of all, it's about the education and understanding what e-bikes is. Other bit is about the cost of e-bike. Basically, it's much higher than the standard bike. And well, in Europe, there are more like the schemes, the financial schemes that allow to buy e-bikes with discounts are more prominent and common, and they've been established for several years. We do not have it in the UK as yet. I think that one of the kind of driving factors. Another one was actually it's a generic factor, not just for e-bikes, the lack of infrastructure, because which is applicable for cycling in general. It's about improving the infrastructure, or adding the segregated cycling lanes to encourage more people, especially women, to cycle, which also will relate into increased number of people who are using the e-bikes too. I think. Another point which has been mentioned is that some people perceive the e-bikes being not, it's like riding an e-bike is perceived being lazy, or people think that they do not bring that same benefits as standard bikes in terms of physical activity. It is correct, but they still do bring the physical benefits, and people do not know about it, and they don't want to be perceived cheating. But it's also about, again, trying an e-bike and actually understanding that through the pedaling you do put in effort, and it's not that easy, and you become active. You're also being outside, and it's just much better in terms of the physical activity level in general.
Can I interrupt you there?
Yes,
and just clear, no, not at all. It's meant to be a conversation. So clearing up this point about it's cheating, it's not proper. Surely, Roger, it's only die-hard cyclists who say things like that. The idea that somehow or other you're meant to be hot and sweaty when you arrive, and that you're meant to feel that you have probably beaten anybody from Fulham Broadway to Canary Wharf on your bicycle, because that's what it's all about. This is all nonsense, isn't it? We've got to dispel that sense of it's not proper.
I agree completely. I was intrigued when you described me as a. Did you say a proper cyclist or a real cyclist in your introduction? Because of course there are so many different people who cycle who have very different definitions of what they mean by a proper cyclist. Are you only a proper cyclist if you ride very long distances very fast, or are you a proper cyclist if you use your bicycle as day-to-day transport? And of course, you can do any or all of these things. They are all good.
So one of the things that Olga mentions in her report is, of course, that there are a lot of people who are not interested in cycling. And I think as we go on and talk about what we might think about as opportunities, we're going to have to address the issue that at the moment, if you want an e-bike, you have to go to a bike shop. And if you're not interested in cycling, that's probably the last place you'll go. So there are a series of barriers of that kind to getting to the people we want to get to. And as Olga's just said, I was talking actually to a colleague in Germany yesterday. They will sell over 2 million e-bikes this year in Germany, and their view was that if the supply chain, which has been difficult right across Europe, not just in the UK, had been at full stretch, they could probably have sold 2.4 million e-bikes. And this year, the Bicycle Association estimates that we might sell 180 to 200,000 in a market which is 3 million bicycles a year. So it is still absolutely trivial. And we're going to talk about what's holding that back and what can we do about it. And it seems to me that those sorts of statistics are really quite astonishing. Shall we, if we may, if that's roughly where we are now, Olga, was there anything you would like to say about where you think we are now before we go on and talk a bit about what the nature of the opportunity is?
Sorry. Yeah, well, I think we kind of covered where we are, that we're lagging behind. People do not know much about e-bikes. It's not like widely accepted. There is a lack of infrastructure, I can say, cycling infrastructure. And the costs of e-bikes perceived quite high at the moment. And they are quite high, and they're not very affordable for the majority of population. I think that's probably a summary of where we are. Yeah.
Very good. I think that's pretty good pretty good summary of where we are. The infrastructure one I do find quite tricky, because that is not going to be solved quickly. And we can't wait for the infrastructure to be perfect to be encouraging people to find a way to use an e-bike. You're absolutely right. Everybody agrees. Roger's been campaigning with Cycling UK in particular for donkey's years about investment in cycling infrastructure. And we do know how much it would cost. But even if we had the sorts of sums that have been calculated, we know it will take a long time to do. And if everybody sits on their hands saying, well, until the infrastructure's there, there's nothing we can do, we have lost the plot completely. So let's move on a bit, and let's talk a bit about the opportunity. And I'd like to really hear what you think about the sorts of people and the types of trips. Olga, what sorts of people and what types of trips?
Well, as we discussed, basically e-bikes allow users to cycle longer, so time and distance, faster, and over hillier geographies. And I think it's also about the average length of an e-bike trip. I think the reports, the different reports across the industry shows that it's around 5 miles for shared bikes. For private bikes, probably will be longer because you just go from A to B rather than the first last mile travel. I think, well, the fact that the nature of an e-bike would, well, it opens up for wider demographic population, in terms of it also can appeal for those people who have some mobility like some mobility issues, or older generation, or those who can, you know, who not used to cycle fast, but want to keep up with their friends. For those who commute using e-bikes, because we obviously don't sweat, and you don't need to. No, you don't sweat that much, and you don't need to have shower. Also, for females, it's been stated that actually females find e-bikes more attractive than compared to standard bikes. And in general, if you look, well, it's more like a bike share start from a Como UK annual survey. The mix of users of shared bikes is quite even, and e-bikes help to bridge the gap between female and male cyclists. It also kind of, I think, it's about the broadening the opportunity for those people who can't afford the car potentially, and they can use an e-bike. Yeah, so wide range of users, to be honest.
So what I find interesting about this is that we keep on talking about cycling and making cycling easier. If I'm not interested in cycling at all, does that mean I'm not really in the market for an e-bike? Who are the people? Who are you talk about them in your report to some extent, the more and different people. Roger, who are we going to get to? They're not going to be people who are avid members of Cycling UK, are they?
Well, there may be some, but that's not the main market. I think there will be some people who have been regular cyclists, whether recreational, utility, day-to-day cyclists all their life, and then they're getting into later in life, or they're suffering health conditions or disabilities that mean they can no longer cycle the way that they used to. But an e-bike will help them keep going. But that is only one part of it. And I think what your comments, Philip, earlier, were that there are two sides to this coin. There are the groups for whom e-bikes can be particularly beneficial, and then there is everyone, and then there's everyone who can benefit from e-bicycles. And it's really important that we keep both sides of that in mind. And now Olga's already touched on this. So there are the people for whom an e-bike can overcome the fact that, I don't feel healthy enough, I don't feel fit enough, I'm too old, I've got too much disability. And electric assistance, particularly on non-standard pedal cycles, adapted pedal cycles for people with disabilities, can enable them to cycle in a way that they thought that these are groups of people who might be thinking cycling is not for someone like me. And then you give them a try before you buy opportunity to try out cycling, and they just on an e-bike, and they discover, oh wow, cycling could be for someone like me. So that's where there are huge health benefits from expanding the demographic of who can take up cycling by giving them the opportunity to try out cycling on an e-bike. But you're absolutely right, Phillip, that the politicians who think that that's all that e-bikes are for are missing the point. This is, Olga has already said that people can make longer journeys, hillier journeys, and that's for anybody and everybody. And that's where the really big climate benefits come in. If people, once people discover that they can cycle about 50% further than they might otherwise have been willing to do, because the e-bike allows them to do that, that's where the real climate benefits come in. And that's why it's so important that people are given that opportunity to discover that making a longer trip than they would otherwise make. And then, of course, there's a bit of a discussion going on in the chat about where are the health benefits of taking up e-bikes. Well, if you just switched from a conventional bicycle to an e-bike for the same cycling trip, then that will be a bit of a loss of health benefits. But if you take up e-biking for what would otherwise have been a car trip, then that's obviously a net gain for health as well as for climate.
And picking up that point about instead of a car trip, I'm really keen that we should all have, if we probably do own a car, have a sticker on the back of it that says "My other car is an e-bike," because I'm sure that there are very, very many families up and down the country, and I realise that in a sense it's privileged, but the number of households that do own two cars is high, and the number of those two household families whose cars have until now, at any rate, been left in the car park at the station for the whole of the day, necessitating the rest of the family to have another car, suddenly are released from that. And again, in Olga's report, you can see some of the huge financial benefits to the individual that come about from saying, actually, I really don't need a car that I park in a station car park all day at all. And as you say, I can now actually do a journey which is perhaps a little longer than I would have even considered on a bicycle, painlessly, easily on my e-bike. So personally, I'm very, very keen on trying to make it clear to people that we're not talking to cyclists, actually. And maybe that's part of the problem between us and Europe, which is that I'm not sure that really we have got people who cycle. We've got lots of cyclists, but just ordinary people who cycle are harder to come by. And I'm really struck by that actually these are people who don't cycle, who've got the most phenomenal opportunity with an e-bike. If only we can get that marketing and positioning right. And we'll come and talk in a moment about how on earth are we going to get there, I think. But more and different people seems to be important. Yes, Olga, please.
Yeah, I also wanted to add that it also can serve those people who live in rural areas or suburban areas where the transport services are infrequent, and that's why they're using the car at the moment. And those people, it's not just even demographic, can be anyone. And basically, because the range and the distance is you can cover with e-bike is much longer, those people are kind of target users of e-bikes and can be potentially kind of benefit the most too.
Yeah, I think that
people.
Absolutely right. And in your report, talking about the opportunities, you were talking about one experiment that carried out over a number of years. And I just thought it was a lovely phrase. It said, when people were questioned about what they felt about it, when they did get an e-bike, a feeling of joy. I thought that's of all the things you might say, oh, well, it's good for my health, or I can go further, or I'm not so hot and bothered. A feeling of joy. I mean, I just think that's amazing, that sense in which suddenly people realize that an e-bike is like having the hand of God behind you as you go uphill, just giving you a very, very gentle push. So I do think that the opportunities you've talked about there are tremendous. And perhaps because I think this is really the essence of my view of what this conversation is about what on earth do we do about it? How do we make it happen? What are the things that we can do? How do we get there? And what have other countries done? What can we learn from them? again, Olga, you've got a bit about other countries.
Yes, absolutely. Well, also before we move, we concentrated so far on personal bikes or shared bikes, but we also need to think about other forms of bikes like e-cargo bikes and the opportunities for the businesses. So I should like to mention that it's not just the personal bikes, it also can open up opportunities for businesses and help with the first last mile travel, and which will lead to also replacing the van trips and leading to significant carbon reduction. So it's kind of something which we haven't covered yet, but we should be talking about.
Well, yes, I sort of agree with that, because I do think that e-cargo bikes present very different issues and problems, and they're not actually about the bike at all. They're about all of the logistics and infrastructure and distribution hubs and road layout that you require. And while I absolutely agree that the government has got to now take this extremely seriously and start to do some real experiments rather than just offering odd grants to people, I think it is quite a tricky area. There are only about 4,000 e-cargo bikes sold a year in the UK, and about 2,000 of those are to people who delightfully, perhaps I shouldn't call it this, but I will, have their kids as cargo. So they're for personal use rather than for commercial use. And I think there's tremendous potential there. E-cargo, certainly on the list, presents a rather lot of different problems. Since I'm the interviewer, I'm allowed to move on from that and say, let's talk a bit about how do we get there, and what do other countries do? And we'll hear from you first and then talk to Roger.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, as we finished on e-cargo bikes, there is a good example of what other countries do in it. There is a Go Pedelec project, which kind of encouraged the whole use of e-bikes and including e-cargo bikes across different countries in Europe. So I think the countries participated included Austria, Czech Republic, Germany, Italy, Hungary, and others. And what the project was about is having the road shows with, I think, over 10,000 participants were actively engaged. And the result of that project was, on average, 18% of e-bike test riders showed a willingness to purchase an e-bike after their test ride. This is kind of shows, yes, you need to show people and you need to educate people, and it is successful because people do go on buying a bike afterwards. I think in Scotland also there is a good scheme which is called Go e-bike, which is run by Sestron, which is a regional authority in Scotland. So one of the initiatives which they've done is in West Lothian. So they've done the West Lothian Bike Library on the basis of a social enterprise, which is based in Livingston in Scotland. And 9 standard e-bikes were offered on short hire periods on the try before you buy offer. And also I think they had 1 e-trike, so different type of e-bike. And well, the outcomes was that 10 e-bikes have been purchased locally within the first 6 months after well, having that library working. It's not big numbers, but it also shows that it is working. People do try and get on buying an e-bike afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Should I stop you there for the moment?
Yes.
Roger, what are we going to do about this? What's going on in other countries that we haven't done yet that might help us on this route of promoting e-bike?
I think the answer is the opposite side of the coin from the barriers that Olga talked about earlier. She talked about incentives, she talked about infrastructure, and we've got to. Yes, you made the point earlier about well, let's do incentives first, because in a way that's the quick one. That's the easy one. We've got all the evidence that they work, that they do in fact get people out of cars. You mentioned Philip, you mentioned the Office for Low Emission Vehicles, Office for Zero Emission Vehicles, as they now are, and yet they don't do anything about supporting e-bikes. that is ridiculous. The Bicycle Association, so your own organisation, wrote a report which found that purely in terms of reducing carbon emissions, e-bike subsidies are twice as cost effective per tonne of carbon saved as car subsidies. And that's before we even begin with all the health and decongestion and other benefits of getting people out of cars. So it's nonsensical that so much of the emphasis
30
is going
million tonnes was
Yes.
their estimate, I think.
Indeed. So when we look at COP26, and Glasgow has got so full of electric cars that I gather there was a fear that they might have to hire in diesel generators because of a lack of charging points for them all. This is absurd. The attention given to electric cars at the expense of electric bicycles makes no sense whatsoever. So yes, we need to put the incentives in place.
Can I stop you on financial incentives for a moment? Because again, from what I know from the Bicycle Association and from Olga's report too, there are very many examples of countries that have given a direct financial incentive for the purchase of an e-bike. Olga mentions some particular examples from unlikely places, not just the likely places. Sweden seems to be not necessarily the place would come top of your list. Greece, I was talking recently to a colleague in Greece. They have had a direct financial incentive for e-bike purchase last year, this year, and next year. It will continue. We know that the French and Paris have done it. We know that Transport Scotland have done it. Somehow or other, the government doesn't seem to be interested in financial incentives. And do you understand why that should be?
We know that there was a time when the Office of Low Emission Vehicles, as it was then, was basically saying we have no evidence that people are going to get out of their cars and onto bicycles. Well, actually, we do. We've got plenty of evidence. You've got all the evidence in both of these reports and many others besides. So we really ought to have knocked that one on the head by now. They also fear that subsidies would just be subsidies for wealthy people to buy e-bikes that they could already afford. Well, you could say that equally of their electric car subsidies, so that one doesn't make any sense either. I do think that there is a good case for both for a general e-bike subsidy on carbon and other grounds, but also for a more targeted programme to enable the people I talked about earlier, the people who have the most to gain from taking up cycling, but are least likely to do so without some kind of support. And at that point, they do need more than just a subsidy. They need those programs that give them the opportunity, the try before you buy opportunity to get on an e-bike and discover that hand of God feeling that you talked about, and that e-bike smile that spreads across the face of everybody when they first get on an e-bike. Because that actually, as I said earlier, cycling is for people like me. That is something that a lot of people in this group don't know, and the only way to give them to overcome that barrier that cycling isn't for people like me is to get them on an e-bike and give them the opportunity to discover from experience that really it is.
So everybody seems to be saying, Olga, at the moment, that one of the big barriers is people don't know what an e-bike really is. They may be concerned about other factors like the quality of the road they stand on, but there seems to be one big barrier of all, which is I've never tried one, so I wouldn't like one because I'm not a cyclist. Try before you buy. What can you say about try before you buy? How do we set about doing that?
Well, I think that we talked about the financial measures. I'll see the logic chain in it.
Okay.
So I'm kind of saying that well, I'm an advocate for financial measures, and I think the financial incentives should be done, but they should be supported on local and regional levels by the local authorities trying to target those or maybe underrepresented groups. But also, I think it should be a part of like a broader strategy to encourage active travel and reduce emissions. And here on the local level, I think try before you buy schemes is something which local authorities should be looking at. I think I've mentioned a few examples, what we've seen that for e-bike scheme did or the European project. The results are very positive. So I think if the local authorities can work with maybe e-bike shops or other organizations to organize them. It's not very easy to organize, but if it happens and you work in collaboration with private sector, I think here you will get lots of benefits for people, and you can organize them easier, in a more easy way.
I'm taken by your point about not very easy to organize, because lots of small schemes have been tried. A shopping mall on a Saturday where you get good footfall and say to people, oh, by the way, I'm demonstrating e-bikes, would you like to try one? Somehow or other, that all seems a little bit amateur and small scale. Don't you think that maybe there are some other opportunities from rather more structured? I mean, if I don't like bike shops, I don't know anything about bikes, I'm not going to go to a bike shop to try one. And yes, of course, a local authority ideally engaging with a bike shop to say, how can you help me? But what about other sorts of schemes? You talk about some of them. What about shared schemes, or somewhere where I could painlessly try it? They're parked in the street because they're part of a bike hire scheme. And so nobody needs to know that I've even tried one. And the assumption, which seems to me to everybody says, is once you've got on, you can scarcely ever bear to get off again. They're so attractive.
Absolutely. So it's about the shared bikes and encouraging having e-bikes as a fleet of shared bikes. And it's actually the trend in the market is that lots of shared schemes operators introducing e-bike fleets into their operations, or new schemes are being started with just e-bikes. I think a good example is Bikes for All scheme in Glasgow, which actually focused on increasing access to cycling by breaking down barriers related to ability and lack of confidence too. So what they've done, the provider is Next Bike, and they introduce discounts for people, and they introduce reduced annual membership fee for people to go and try those e-bikes and use them in Glasgow area. One of the restrictions is that, the use of the shared scheme, there is an operating area. So you're only allowed to use that bike within the operating area. So potentially you may be living somewhere far outside, but this is a great initiative. And also on top of just providing the annual memberships, they've done the group training, and the group training of how to use an e-bike, a shared e-bike, was very successful, and people found it like the group setting made them feel that they're not by themselves, and there are other people who do not understand about e-bikes too, and it's just comforting on psychological level, and it's been quite successful. And I think there's a powerful start from that Bikes for All initiative. They said that 52% of participants had never cycled before, and 30% of them have started cycling regularly. So 52% didn't cycle before. It's quite a big number, isn't it?
No, that's brilliant. That's exactly the point we were making earlier, I think, about a completely different target audience, if you will, not cyclists at all. Roger, bike hire, bike loan, bike rental, what experience do you have of those as ideas?
Well, firstly, I've gained some wonderful new neighbours literally just across the road from me. There's a little a yard that the police used to replete their police vehicles, and then there was a paper shredding company, and now a new startup has moved in, who are putting out dockless e-bikes, hired e-bikes out in a couple of central London boroughs. And I'm not going to upset one e-bike company by not naming one and not another and all the rest of it, because we're in the business of promoting the whole sector. But I love what the hired e-bike companies are doing. They have the company across the road have pitched their pricing specifically to make it easy for people who might not otherwise be able to afford to give it a try. So that too is a way of doing try before you buy. And I really think there is potentially an opportunity to join up the sorts of initiatives that Olga was talking about. Cycling UK, we run programs very much like the Bike for All initiative, where community cycle clubs, so any group, whether it's a whether it's health patients, whether it's people with disabilities, whether it's immigrants, whether it's, all sorts of communities who are just getting together for some reason or other, and you can give them cycling as a group activity. And Olga's absolutely right that inviting people to take up cycling in a group rather than on their own makes a huge difference. If you do it on your own, you feel you're being really worthy and it's hard work and you're not quite sure how to carry your clothes and all of those things. You have to find it out for yourself. Whereas if you do it with a group, it's much more fun. You feel you're not on your own. You're not the only person in the world who doesn't know the answers to all those questions. So yes, group activities using the hire bikes that are out there. That would be a really good combination. I'm very interested to explore it.
Yeah, very good. I think that there are a host of ideas in this area which are really valuable. One we haven't mentioned so far, just mentioned in passing perhaps, because I've got half an eye on the clock, is the Cycle to Work scheme. And of course, the Cycle to Work scheme was limited in its value to a maximum of £1,000, and the DFT with the Revenue and Customs managed to take that limit away to enable people who have a job, are in employment, and are prepared to can afford to go through a salary sacrifice scheme for 12 or 18 months to get an e-bike. And certainly the opportunity, therefore, locally to engage with businesses and say, are your employees making the most of that cycle to work opportunity, seems to me to be another good idea. There are, in Olga's report, there are 2 or 3 pages which are headed conclusion, which are really only the start, in which she talks about a range of financial incentives. She talks about information, talks about safety and security, and talks about shared e-bikes. And a very, very nice example about targeting that you mentioned in your report, Olga, I thought was being able to target people in key jobs, carers you mentioned in particular, people who are perhaps also in the medical profession, visiting people at home and have to move from place to place. And I've seen a number of examples of this, where with a car, it takes me as long to find a place to park my car to go into the person I'm caring for or checking up on as it does to do the checkup. And actually, an e-bike is a perfect way. And so being able to think about who we go to, could we go to our NHS trust and say, is there a way in which we, as your local authority, could fund an experiment? And you're right, Olga, which includes training and includes getting 2 or 3 people together so that you don't feel self-conscious and you're not quite sure. But I do think that in your report, there's some really terrific things about shared use, and all of them come back to this central issue about how do you break through. I think it came up one of the questions actually. How do you break through to say to people, try it, just try it? And I myself have seen lots of people who've been very skeptical, who you say, just get on it and see what happens. And one counsellor, actually, we thought we'd lost him because he was so skeptical. He said, I'll give it a try after a lot of argument. And we had to go out looking for him after half an hour because he was enjoying it so much. Now, it is, according to my watch, about 1:45. And there are, I was told there would be about 3 or 4 questions. There are loads and loads of questions that have come in, which is terrific. And it's very, very good. And I'm wondering how on earth I'm going to deal with those. One that came in quite early on and is actually mentioned in the possibilities, Olga, is scrappage, car scrappage schemes. Why don't you trade in your old banger, a polluting banger, and get a funding for the purchase of an e-bike? Is that practical? Have people done that?
Yes, of course. It's also, we talk about it in the report. It comes under the more like financial incentives. It has been done in France, has been done in the States, in America, in California. It's kind of also encourages people to give up their own vehicle, the car. So actually supports the move from the car because you don't have the vehicle. I think in terms of what happens in the UK, so far there hasn't been any scrappage scheme established. I think focusing on e-bikes. The closest example would be the scheme which is run by Transport for West Midlands. I think they call it like mobility credits. And the scheme looks at scrapping the cars, and they offer £3,000 in the credits towards the cost of alternative transport modes, including like buses, shared bikes, trains, taxis, car hire, over the next 2 years. The current fleet, the shared fleet in Transport for West Midlands at the moment doesn't have e-bikes, but it's something they can introduce in future. But at least they've started with this scrappage scheme, and I think it's the first one in the UK. I mean, on such a scale, and it's just been tested. And I don't have any information on how successful it is, but it would be really good to find out. And I'm sure they will publish the results, because I think it's been done as a part of Future Transport Zone, because the region receives funds from DFT.
If I could just pick up tangentially the Future Transport Zones, Roger, you have been much involved in campaigning about planning and the need for planning. It seems to me that housing developments would be an absolutely ideal starting point for perhaps a local authority in negotiation with housing developments to think about the provision of electric bikes, how much car parking space they don't provide. Have you been involved in that at all?
The general point about new developments and how cycle friendly they are is well made, but there's and we're going to need to campaign around that when the government's planning bill comes forward. The original planning proposals under the previous planning secretary really were very unhelpful in all sorts of ways. I won't digress onto that, but there is another point relating to planning which is probably more relevant here, which is that when people are moving home, that's a kind of change in their sort of life cycle, a life cycle changing event, the change of a job, change of location, adding a member of the family, losing a member of the family, all those sort of things that disrupt your travel habits are fantastic opportunities to give people that opportunity to rethink. So if as part of the grant for planning permission, a developer were to put in place some kind of a financial incentive similar to the scrappage schemes that Olga was talking about, effectively mobility credits rather than providing car parking space, that could be huge. And it'll work better in some locations than in others. But let's face it, the locations where it wouldn't work well are the sort of places where we really shouldn't be putting housing in the first place. The places that are just so remote that they're car-dependent locations. That's where we shouldn't be building housing. The sort of places where housing can support sustainable transport, actually adding an incentive to get people to rethink how they get around at the point where so much else has changed, that could be huge.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Very good. And looking at the questions in the highly selective way that I'm privileged to do today, probably never again, is a question about incentivization as a key tool. And is there evidence from different places on how incentives have affected uptakes? The answer to that is yes. I'm not going to go into it, but it is well documented, and you'll probably find some links to that in what Olga has said. Certainly, as Roger kindly mentioned, the Bicycle Association's proposals to government, which are available on the Bicycle Association's website, also make very clear that there's really excellent evidence about the effectiveness of financial incentives. There's a lovely question that I would love to get into, and I'm not going to, because that will absolutely destroy the rest of the afternoon, which is about how do we think that e-scooters will have an impact on e-bike take-up. I'm really not going to go there today, but I'm urging Jonathan to have a whole session given over to the currently illegal use of e-scooters on our roads. Go on.
We're not going to dwell about it, but in the report there are actually some stats from Beryl, a bike share operator, on what's happening with e-scooters versus e-bikes. So if you're interested, yeah, have a look. It's a boxed case study and it has some stats on it.
Brilliant. Well done. There are a number of questions too about what I would call supportive infrastructure. What are we going to do about theft? These are valuable vehicles. What are we going to do about parking? And it is the case that, as with so many aspects of cycling, you are going to have to think about the whole chain of things that are needed. Somebody has referenced, would it be a good idea to focus on 20-mile-an-hour zones, because where traffic is slower, then people are not so confident. So I really do think trying to join it up in a number of initiatives is quite important. And certainly the temptation to say, well, actually, we'll do this scheme for e-bikes and then find that people get to the middle of town, nowhere to park it, or where they do is extremely dangerous for theft. Cycle parking at stations, big issue. What are we going to do about e-bike parking at stations? I'm very conscious there are about 4 minutes left. So I think that, Roger, you might want to say something before we close, something we haven't covered, or something you feel we didn't make sufficiently important, or something we did make important and you want to say it again.
I'm going to take the what have we not yet covered, which is related to supportive infrastructure. There's so much we could say about parking. Residential cycle parking, actually, I should have said that when we talked about planning just now, but residential cycle planning, both retrofit as well as in new build, that is also an important issue. But I'm going to talk about maximising the potential of e-bikes as a rural transport solution, because the government consulted on a rural transport strategy and said e-bikes are the solution. Technology, it's great. To which Cycling UK, in our response, we said, yes, that is great. It is a part of the solution to decarbonising rural transport, but not without the infrastructure. Now, the infrastructure that we need for rural areas is actually rather different from the infrastructure we need for urban areas, because if you think that for a large city, a large proportion of the cars travelling within a large city will be making a journey wholly within that city, starting and ending within that city. For a smaller town, that will not be the case. Most of the cars in a small town will be travelling to or from an adjoining town or a nearby village or straight through the town. Therefore, the barrier to getting people out of their cars in that town is not the hostile cycling, the dangerous traffic on the streets within that town. It's actually a 60 mph rural single carriageway. And therefore, the planning of cycle networks to enable people to get out of cars and onto e-bikes in rural areas, you need to be thinking about alternatives to the 60 mph single carriageway. And at a time when e-bike subsidies are promised but not yet with us from the government, this is a moment for local authorities in more rural areas to really think about what they could do to maximise the benefits of cycling, to not think cycling is just for the greater Manchesters and the greater Londons of the world. It is for the rural areas too, particularly with e-bike governments coming along. Okay.
Olga, a last word from you.
Yeah, absolutely. I've just seen the comments about the question from Claire. It's about women and basically some patterns which women have when they travel, and how is it relevant with e-bikes? Because, well, as we know, women tend to travel with children. There's lots of grocery shopping, etc. I think what we're also noticing is that, well, potential role for personal e-cargo bikes here. And as Philip mentioned, that they are being used to transfer children. I can see myself more women using them. They do need the training. You need to adjust for e-cargo bikes. So it's not as easy, but I think that e-cargo bike can play a huge role supporting women traveling with the groceries and the goods.
I think we're going to have another session on e-cargo bikes, Jonathan, if you're listening. I think we're going to stop there. I knew it would happen, that there's some very experienced people who are out there listening to us, and one of them has very rightly said, everything you're saying, Philip, we're already doing. And it's working very well up in the northeast. And then there was another comment to Roger. We're already doing everything you're saying. That's fantastic. If you really want to know more, it's quite clear that Craig Cooper in the northeast is the man to talk to. And no names, no pack drill, Craig. But that is very good. The purpose of this event isn't, I think, to tell people things that they really, really don't know, but hopefully to share some experiences, to share some ideas, and maybe create a network among all of you, which UTG does, of people doing things together and learning from one another. So I hope we haven't bored you to death about this, but rather enthused you and encouraged you about just what there is by way of potential for e-bikes.
Great. Thanks, Philip, Olga and Roger, for what was a fantastic discussion and conversation, and certainly got people going on the chat and the Q&A. It was always a good sign. I think a few quick takeaways from me. I think the key thing about e-bikes, it extends a range of trips and the range of people who use bikes more and different. But what are the obstacles to more people experiencing the joy, the feeling of joy of e-bikes, the e-bike smile? Two things I remember from this conversation. I think it's getting across that e-bikes ain't cheating, and that you don't need to be a quotes cyclist, end quotes, to use one. It also needs to move more centre stage to government policy. Why isn't the Office of Zero Emission Vehicles interested? We need to give people more opportunities to try them, to understand what they are. We need to get the cost down, and we need the infrastructure in place to support it. So our next Urban Transport Next event will be a one-on-one interview with Lee Waters, who is the Welsh Government's Transport Minister, the man behind the new path for transport policy in Wales, road user charging, a freeze on road building, a target for home working. Arguably, Wales is the nation of the four nations of the UK that's leading the way. Really hope you can join us for that on Thursday, the 2nd of December at 12 a.m. And in the meantime, thanks again to Philip, to Olga and Roger, to everyone who took part live, for those listening in to the podcast or watching the playback on YouTube. Thank you and goodbye.